They fire, and the silence that follows is wrong. Something meant to end the danger simply vanishes beneath the water, leaving the enemy untouched and the crew exposed. This was supposed to be the moment of control, the instant when training and trust paid off. Instead, the weapon betrays them, and the mission turns inside out. What was promised as certainty becomes doubt, then fear. Somewhere far from this steel hull, someone already suspected this could happen. Not enough to stop it. Not enough to warn the men who would pay for it. So when a weapon fails this completely, in a moment this final, who decides that the people using it are expendable? The submarine slides into position with a patience born of habit, the crew watching shadows move above them as the target crosses their path, close enough to feel inevitable. Orders pass quietly, hands move automatically, and the moment arrives exactly as rehearsed. A torpedo leaves the tube and races ahead, clean and confident, carrying every hope stacked onto this single action. The second stretch. Men count in their heads. They wait for the shock they have been trained to expect, the violent punctuation that means survival. Instead, there is nothing. No rupture. No sudden lift of pressure. Just the slow, unbearable realization that the enemy ship is still moving, still alive, still free to react. Above them, unaware of how narrowly it escaped destruction, the target begins to turn. The hunters feel the balance shift as sonar returns change shape. No longer passive, no longer distant. Another torpedo is fired, then another, each one carrying the same promise, each one disappearing into the deep with the same hollow outcome. The attack that should have ended the encounter only announces their presence. Depth charges soon follow, hammering the water with brutal rhythm, the submarine shuddering as lights flicker and metal groans under the strain. Inside, there is no time to argue about what went wrong. The failure is already complete. The mission has broken at the exact moment it was supposed to succeed, and now the crew's survival depends on enduring the consequences of a weapon that did not do its job. They sink deeper, quieter, clinging to the thin hope that the enemy's search will falter. But the damage is done. This is not a miscalculation or bad luck playing its usual role. This is a point of no return, where trust in a critical promise collapses in real time, and everyone on board understands that something fundamental has failed, something that turns a controlled strike into a desperate attempt to escape with their lives. What makes this moment unbearable is how confidently it was never supposed to happen. Long before this patrol, long before these men slipped beneath the surface, the weapon they carried had been spoken of with near certainty. It was described as reliable, decisive, the quiet equalizer that would allow a submerged crew to strike without warning and disappear again into safety. Training reinforced that belief. Briefings repeated it. Every drill assumed that when the order was given, the result would follow. The torpedo was not framed as a gamble, but as a guarantee, a promise that if the submarine could get close enough, the outcome was already decided. This expectation shaped everything: how aggressively commanders planned, how risks were weighed, how close boats dared to move toward danger. Confidence in the weapon created confidence in the mission itself. Yet what unfolded beneath the waves shatters that illusion completely. The failure is not subtle or partial. It is absolute. The torpedo does not merely perform poorly, it erases the very logic of the attack. Instead of delivering resolution, it extends exposure. Instead of ending the threat, it multiplies it. The men inside the submarine are left confronting a contradiction they were never trained to face. The plan was executed correctly, the conditions were right, and still the weapon did nothing. This gap between expectation and reality is where the real tension lives. The Navy's belief was not casual or uncertain. It was institutional. It lived in manuals and orders, in the quiet assurance passed from senior officers to junior ones. And now that belief collides with a scene that makes no sense within that framework. A weapon designed to decide outcomes refuses to decide anything at all. The result is not just a failed attack, but collapse of trust in the system that sent these men here. What should have been a moment of control becomes a moment of helpless waiting, every second stretching as the enemy remains intact. The contrast is brutal. On paper, the submarine held the advantage. In reality, it is suddenly fragile, hunted, exposed by its own supposed strength. There is no immediate explanation offered, no acknowledgement of error, only the growing awareness that the rules everyone relied on no longer apply. This is why the failure feels so dangerous. It is not a surprise born of chaos, but one born of misplaced certainty. The weapon was expected to work not because of luck, but because it had been declared ready, trusted, and pushed into service with confidence. That confidence now becomes a liability, because it encouraged missions that assumed success was already solved. When that assumption collapses, it leaves crews stranded between what they were promised and what they are experiencing. The torpedo's silence becomes louder than any explosion, because it forces a realization that the system may be built on an untested belief. And if that belief is wrong, then every decision shaped by it is suddenly suspect. This moment does not ask why the failure happened. It simply exposes the cost of expecting perfection from something that was never challenged hard enough. The weapon was supposed to remove uncertainty from war. Instead, it introduces a deeper, more dangerous one, turning confidence into vulnerability at the exact moment it was needed most. What makes this failure impossible to dismiss is that it does not stay isolated to a single patrol or a single crew. As reports quietly accumulate, the same pattern surfaces again and again, always wearing a different face but ending the same way. Submarines maneuver into ideal positions, execute attacks exactly as trained, and wait for results that never arrive. Torpedoes run clean and true, passing beneath enemy ships or striking without effect, leaving targets damaged only in theory. Each time, the aftermath follows a familiar rhythm: confusion, disbelief, then the urgent need to evade retaliation. The repetition strips away any comfort that this could be bad luck. Different crews, different waters, different moments of pressure, yet the same hollow outcome. A weapon designed to end encounters keeps extending them, turning decisive strikes into prolonged dangers. With every incident, the margin for denial shrinks. The problem does not adapt or evolve. It repeats itself with mechanical consistency. Commanders begin to recognize the emotional pattern as much as the operational one. The initial faith, the stunned waiting, the creeping dread as the enemy remains intact. Each failure reinforces the last, creating a chain of near-identical moments where expectation collapses in real time. What is most unsettling is how familiar the experience becomes to those who survive it. Stories circulate in guarded language, hints exchanged between crews who have faced the same silence after firing. No single event is loud enough to force immediate reckoning, but together they form a drumbeat that cannot be ignored. The failures echo across missions, not as rare anomalies but as recurring features of the fight. The same weapon, trusted in the same way, produces the same dangerous void where certainty should be. At some point, coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. The repetition demands a harder question. How many times can the same thing go wrong before it is no longer considered an accident? Each new incident tightens the pattern, turning isolated shock into an emerging truth. Something embedded in the system itself is failing, and it is failing predictably. Yet operations continue, attacks are ordered, and crews are sent out carrying the same promise that has already betrayed others. The danger is no longer just the enemy above the waves, but the growing realization below them that this weapon's silence is not random. It is consistent. And consistency in war is never meaningless. By the time these patterns become impossible to ignore, the most disturbing detail is not the failure itself, but the quiet evidence that it was not entirely unexpected. Doubts had surfaced earlier, spoken in careful language and buried in routine channels. Test runs raised questions that were easy to minimize. Field reports hinted at irregular behavior that did not fit the official confidence. Some officers hesitated, others pushed back, their concerns framed as anomalies or conditions that could be corrected later. Nothing dramatic enough to halt operations, nothing urgent enough to break momentum. The warnings did not arrive as alarms. They arrived as unease, as notes that something felt wrong but not yet disastrous. And so they were delayed, softened, or absorbed into a system already committed to moving forward. The weapon was already deployed, the doctrine already written, the missions already planned. Acknowledging the risk would have meant slowing down, rethinking, admitting uncertainty at a moment when certainty was desperately needed. So the doubts lingered without resolution. They sat in reports that did not circulate widely, in conversations that ended without decisions. Each ignored concern became easier to dismiss after the last one failed to force change. Over time, silence replaced urgency. Not because nothing was wrong, but because addressing it carried consequences no one wanted to face. This is where the story shifts from misfortune to choice. The failures at sea were not unfolding in a vacuum. They were echoing against a backdrop of known discomfort, untested assumptions, and unresolved questions. The system did not lack signals. It lacked the will to stop and listen. And with every mission launched under that shadow, the distance between awareness and action grew wider, more dangerous, and harder to defend. The failures continued, not because no one suspected the risk, but because suspicion alone was allowed to remain incomplete. The weight of these decisions does not settle on paper or in offices. It settles inside steel hulls and behind closed hatches, where crews live with the consequences in real time. Inside submarines pushed into silence, men replay the moment of firing again and again, wondering how something so trusted could leave them so exposed. They listen to the ocean turn hostile, every unfamiliar sound carrying the threat of discovery, every vibration hinting at pursuit. The failure follows them long after the attack is over, shaping how they sleep, how they listen, how they brace for impact. Some missions end with battered hulls limping home, the crew shaken but alive, carrying a truth they are unsure how to speak aloud. Others do not return at all, vanishing after encounters where the weapon's silence gave the enemy time to strike back. The loss is not abstract. It is felt in empty bunks, in patrols that leave with full crews and come back lighter, in commands that cannot fully explain what went wrong. These men were not reckless. They followed orders, trusted their training, and relied on the tools they were given. When those tools failed, they absorbed the risk personally, absorbing fear and responsibility that was never meant to be theirs alone. Each unsuccessful attack forces crews into prolonged danger, turning moments meant to be swift into drawn-out tests of endurance. The human cost accumulates quietly, not in dramatic announcements, but in exhaustion, in trauma carried forward, in the knowledge that survival sometimes depended less on skill than on chance. The system's failures become personal scars, etched into the memories of those who lived through them and into the silence surrounding those who did not. These were real people placed in impossible positions, asked to execute plans built on confidence that had already begun to crack. And every time a mission ended badly, the price was paid not by the abstractions of policy, but by individuals who had no say in the risks they were ordered to carry. What lingers after all of this is not a clean answer, but a question that refuses to stay buried. The failures were seen, repeated, and felt, yet they moved forward anyway, wrapped in language that softened risk and postponed accountability. Somewhere between confidence and denial, a line was crossed, and once crossed, it became easier to keep going than to stop and confront what had already been set in motion. The ocean closed over the evidence, patrols ended, and new ones began, each carrying the same quiet vulnerability beneath official certainty. There is no single moment where responsibility can be neatly assigned, no dramatic confession that resolves the tension. Instead, there is an uncomfortable possibility that this was not an isolated lapse, but a reflection of how institutions protect momentum even when momentum becomes dangerous. If a system can absorb warning signs without changing course, how many failures can pass before they are accepted as normal? And if lives are lost in that space between knowing and acting, what does accountability even mean? The story does not end with correction or closure. It ends with the unsettling thought that this failure may have been tolerated because it was inconvenient to stop, and that other silences, just as deadly, may still be hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered only after the cost has already been paid. This story pauses here, not because it is finished, but because it opens outward into something larger and harder to contain. The failure you've heard about did not exist in isolation, and it did not disappear when the patrols ended. It settled into procedures, into habits, into the quiet confidence that tomorrow's mission would somehow be different without anything truly changing. The sea has a way of hiding evidence, but it also preserves patterns, and those patterns tend to resurface when least expected. What happened with this weapon suggests a deeper question about how danger is managed, how doubt is handled, and how easily risk can be reassigned downward until it reaches the people least able to refuse it. If one silence was allowed to persist this long, it invites a more troubling thought. How many others were folded into routine, filed away, or rationalized as acceptable loss? This chapter closes without resolution because resolution was never immediate. The echoes of this failure stretch forward, touching other systems, other decisions, other moments when certainty was declared before it was earned. And somewhere beneath the surface, more unanswered questions remain, waiting for the moment when silence is no longer enough to contain them.